On the 12th of December, 1937, Japanese naval aircraft bombed and sank an American warship on the Yangtze River above Nanking. The gunboat Panay was flying American flags, spread across her awnings in clear daylight. 3 Americans were killed. Dozens more were wounded. Newsreel cameramen aboard filmed the whole attack. Japan apologized, called it a mistake, and paid an indemnity of just over $2.2 million. American public opinion opposed any military response. Roosevelt briefly considered one, then let it go. The incident was settled and within a few years, largely forgotten. In Tokyo, it was not forgotten. Japan had sunk an American warship and killed American sailors, and America had accepted a check to the officers planning Japan's future. That told them something about the United States, something they would build an entire war on. By the summer of 1941, Japan was in a corner of its own making. Its army had been fighting in China for 4 years. Its economy ran on imported oil, roughly 90% of it from overseas, most of that from the United States. Then, on the 24th of July 1941, Japanese forces occupied southern French Indochina. 2 days later, Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and placed oil exports under license. In practice, no licenses were issued. Japan's fuel supply was cut off at the source. The Navy held the largest stockpile, and everyone in the Japanese leadership worked from the same arithmetic. Admiral Nagano Osami, chief of the Naval General Staff, told Emperor Hirohito directly that the oil would last about 2 years. Lieutenant General Suzuki Teiichi, head of the Cabinet Planning Board, told the Imperial Conference on the 6th of September 1941 that Japan's resources could sustain roughly 2 years of full-scale war against America, Britain, and the Netherlands. 2 years. Nobody had a plan for year 3, which meant the war had to end inside 2 years. And since no one in Tokyo believed Japan could physically defeat the United States, the war could only end one way. America would have to decide to stop fighting. That was not a desperate afterthought. It was the official plan. On the 15th of November 1941, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor, the liaison conference between the government and Imperial General Headquarters adopted a document called the Draft Proposal for Hastening the End of the War. It was the only war termination plan Japan had. Its logic ran like this: destroy the American, British, and Dutch bases in the Far East, seize the oil, rubber, and tin of the southern resource area, fortify a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and dig in. Then cooperate with Germany to force Britain into submission, because once Britain fell, the United States would lose the will to continue the war, and Japan could bring the conflict to a draw. There was no mechanism in the document for how the negotiations would actually start. No plan for defeating America. Only the assumption that America, bloodied and discouraged, watching its allies collapse, would quit. Where did that assumption come from? Partly from history. Japan had beaten a larger power before, within living memory of every man in the room. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia not by conquering it, but by destroying the Russian fleet at Tsushima, after which a third party brokered peace. Hit hard, win the decisive battle, get the enemy to the table. It had worked once. The entire Japanese Navy was built around doing it again, and partly, the assumption came from real evidence. The Panay was one piece. There were others. On the 12th of August 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States House of Representatives voted on whether to extend the draft. Had the vote failed, the American Army would have begun dissolving that autumn. It passed by 203 votes to 202, 1 vote. That same summer, Gallup found roughly 8 out of 10 Americans opposed to entering the war. Japanese planners could read those numbers as easily as anyone. This was not a nation straining at the leash. On top of the evidence sat contempt. Japanese propaganda taught soldiers that Americans were soft, materialistic, unwilling to die, a people who relied on machines because they lacked spirit. A pamphlet issued to troops shipping south in 1941, titled "Read This Alone and the War Can Be Won," spelled it out. Japanese spirit, Yamato Damashi, would offset American steel. The contempt ran both ways. In Washington, Roosevelt and Hull could not take seriously the idea that Japan would attack the United States. Ambassador Joseph Grew cabled from Tokyo on the 10th of November 1941, warning that Japan might go all out in a do-or-die effort, risking what he called national harakiri, and that conflict might come with dangerous and dramatic suddenness. The warning was not acted on. Each side was certain the other lacked the stomach for a fight. Most of what we know about Japan's reasoning comes from the paper it left behind, the liaison conference decisions, the Imperial Conference transcripts, the post-war interrogations of men like Nagano. Documents like those are what Warshelf is built from, a library of short books on the Second World War, each one a single closed story, every source named in the back of every volume. The link is in the description. Inside Japan, the assumption did not go unchallenged. In April 1941, a new institution opened in Tokyo, the Total War Research Institute, modeled on Britain's Imperial Defense College. Its members were hand-picked mid-career officers and officials, average age 33. Through the summer, they ran a full simulation of a war against the United States and its allies. On the 27th and 28th of August, 1941, they reported their conclusion. Japan would lose. Early victories would give way to a long war of attrition. Shipping losses would make the war unsustainable. After 1943, there was no path to victory. Tojo Hideki, then Army Minister, sat in the audience. Witnesses described him going pale as the conclusion was read. Then he stood and dismissed it. "This is, after all, a desktop exercise," he said. "Actual wars do not go as you fellows imagine." He pointed to the war against Russia, which Japan had also been expected to lose. That same August, Colonel Iwakuro Hideo of the Army Ministry, the officer responsible for procurement, briefed the leadership on the raw comparison of war potential. American steel production, 20 times Japan's. Oil, more than 100 times. Aircraft, 5 times. Overall war potential, 10 to 1. His conclusion was that at those odds, Japan could not win, Japanese spirit notwithstanding. The most senior admiral in the fleet agreed. In the autumn of 1940, Yamamoto Isoroku, commander of the combined fleet, told Prime Minister Konoe that if ordered to fight the United States, he would run wild for 6 months or a year, but had utterly no confidence for the second and third years. In January 1941, he put it more brutally in a letter to a nationalist politician. "To make victory certain," he wrote, "it would not be enough to take Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. Japan would have to march into Washington and dictate peace in the White House." He was not boasting. He was telling war enthusiasts that beating America meant occupying its capital, which was absurd, and therefore the war was absurd. None of it mattered. At the Imperial Conference on the 6th of September 1941, the Emperor, who by convention never spoke, read aloud a poem written by his grandfather. "I believe that every sea, to every other, is bound together as a brother. Why is it now the seas must rise to strike each other with angry cries? The room understood it as a rebuke. The policy did not change." Even Nagano, asked whether a surprise attack would deliver a victory like Port Arthur in 1904, answered that it was doubtful Japan would win at all. He supported the war anyway. Waiting meant slow strangulation as the oil ran down. Acting now at least offered a chance. On the 17th of October, Tojo became Prime Minister. On the 1st of December, the Imperial Conference confirmed the decision for war. The strike force bound for Pearl Harbor was already at sea. At first, the plan worked better than anyone had dared project. The Army's timetable gave 53 days for the Philippines, 100 for Malaya, 150 for the Dutch East Indies. Manila fell on the 2nd of January 1942. Singapore surrendered on the 15th of February, a month ahead of schedule. Rangoon and Java fell in early March. Japan took the entire southern resource area early and cheaply. The victories seemed to prove the calculation had been right all along. But the one number that mattered had already moved, and it had moved in a single weekend. On the 8th of December, 1941, Congress declared war on Japan. The Senate voted 82 to nothing. The House, 388 to 1. Days later, Gallup measured public approval of the declaration at 97%. The 8 in 10 Americans who had wanted no part of the war in the summer were gone. Pearl Harbor had not broken American will. It had manufactured it overnight in a quantity no Japanese planner had imagined possible. The rest of the assumption collapsed on schedule. Britain did not fall. Germany did not win. In April 1942, American bombers appeared over Tokyo. In June, 4 Japanese carriers went down at Midway. On the 7th of August 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, 8 months after Pearl Harbor, months earlier than any Japanese estimate of when America could counterattack. Then, on the 24th of January 1943, at Casablanca, Roosevelt announced that the Allies would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender from Germany, Italy, and Japan. Japan's entire theory of victory required a negotiated peace. That day, in a single sentence, the one outcome the plan depended on was formally taken off the table. There was still one part of the theory left to test. The fortified perimeter was supposed to bleed America until it stopped. In November 1943, the Marines assaulted Tarawa, a coral islet in the Gilberts. They took it in 76 hours, at a cost of just over 1,000 Marines killed and 2,000 wounded, losses comparable to 6 months on Guadalcanal, compressed into 3 days. Roosevelt had recently lifted the ban on publishing photographs of American dead, and images of bodies in the surf ran in newspapers across the country. There was shock, there was protest, there was angry mail, and the campaign continued on schedule. America had been shown, in photographs, exactly what the perimeter would cost, and did not stop. That was the test, and the theory failed it. Meanwhile, the war of attrition the young officers of the Total War Research Institute had predicted was arriving almost to the year. Japan's Navy had projected shipping losses of around 1 million tons in the first year, falling after that. In 1942, Japan lost about 1.1 million tons of merchant shipping. In 1943, over 2 million. In 1944, over 4 million, roughly 5 times the pre-war projection. The United States, in the same years, built nearly 34 million tons of new shipping, more in the first 4.5 months of 1943 than Japan launched in 7 years. The cargo ships that fed Japan's island empire and its home islands were going to the bottom faster than they could ever be replaced. By 1945, Japan had lost its fleet, its perimeter, and its supply lines. American bombers were burning its cities. And yet the original assumption did not die. It simply moved home. On the 8th of April 1945, the Imperial Army issued the directive for Ketsugo, the decisive operation for the defense of the home islands. Its purpose was not to hold ground. It was to kill as many Americans as possible in the invasion at any cost in Japanese lives, in order to break the will of the American people and force a negotiated end that avoided occupation. Japanese planners had identified the enemy's center of gravity, and it was the same one they had identified in 1941, American public opinion, American tolerance for casualties. Nearly 3 million men were assembled to defend the home islands on that theory. It was the same bet, made again, with 4 years of contrary evidence in between. The nation that had accepted a check for the Panay, that had kept its army by a single vote, had by then absorbed Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, and was still coming. After the surrender, American interrogators sat down with Admiral Nagano, the man who had told the Emperor Japan had oil for 2 years. He answered their questions plainly. Japan could carry on the war successfully for about 2 years, he said. After that, there would arise the question of replenishment and definite difficulties from that time on. It was the same estimate he had given in 1941. He had been right about his own country to the month. He had only been wrong about the other one.